Good morning. I am Annette Johnson, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Women's Mental Health and the Justice System. This community dialogue is sponsored by the Chicago, Illinois Links Incorporated in partnership with the Office of Lieutenant Governors, Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, and the University of Illinois Chicago Jane Addams Center for Social Policy and Research, and is hosted by the Jane Addams College of Social Work. Each of these organizations has a notable and strong commitment to social justice and equity. This collaboration started in the fall of 2019, and we were 2 weeks away from mounting this dialogue in March of 2020 when shelter in place began as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. In the planning process, all of the partners were concerned about the impact of mental health and substance abuse on incarcerated women and the many barriers that they face as they transition back to the community. We know that COVID has changed the landscape for all of us, but the issues have multiplied tenfold for formerly incarcerated women. So we thank you today for sharing this time with us to discuss policies and strategies to increase access to mental health services for women returning to the community. I wish to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Joe Strickland, who served as co-chair of the planning team and provided major input throughout this process. Joe is unable to be with us today, but for those of you who know Joe, you can attest that his knowledge, expertise, dedication, and commitment to this work is unparalleled. So Joe, we thank you for your significant contributions. It is now my pleasure to present two very special people who provide inspiration and leadership to so many. Creasie Finney Hairston is the Dean of the Jane Addams College of Social Work. She also serves as Director of the Jane Addams Center for Social Policy and Research. Dean Hairston is one of the pioneers in the field of criminal justice and is so instrumental in developing family programs for correction populations. She has conducted research and written extensively on the impact of incarceration on children, families, and communities. Ms. Risa Davis is the president of the Chicago, Illinois chapter of the Links. She has provided leadership to the Chicago Links in developing and promoting mental health awareness and stigma reduction. Both of these will now bring greetings. Dean Hairston.
Good morning and welcome to everyone who's gathered wherever you are to participate in today's forum. It is certainly my pleasure to extend greetings to you and to let you know that we are very pleased at the Policy Center to host this forum. The topic that we're going to be covering is a very important one, and it is one that really is at the heart and center of the work that we do at the Policy Center, and I might add at the college as well. The impact of incarceration on children, families, and communities is a major area of work for us. It really informs our research, our policy analysis, our engagement with community partners, and our public service activities, similar to the forum that we're having today. One of the principles, and I should say the guiding principle for our work at the center, is that persons whose lives are directly impacted by whatever it is we are studying or doing are collaborators and partners in that work. It is also very important for us that the experiences of those persons and families and communities are really centered in that work, and that our work is not based simply on conceptual frameworks, theories, and our own beliefs. Though, of course, being in a college of social work in a major university, theories and conceptual frameworks are important as well. I think you will see that principle reflected in today's forum. I do want to thank our Lieutenant Governor and our keynote speaker, and the women who will be serving on the panel today. I also want to acknowledge all of the women, and I know there were some men who worked with us as well, who did the background work, the behind the scenes work to make this forum today a reality. I know that each of us will leave with new understandings about women's experiences in the criminal justice system, specifically their experiences with incarceration. I hope that we will also leave with more knowledge and understanding about concrete actions that each of us can take as individuals, or maybe working with a group or groups to make things better and different. I often say at the college, let's make a positive difference that matters. And now, without further ado, an expression that I learned as a child while sitting in church, without further ado, I pass the mic. Now, I did not learn I passed the mic in church, but I passed the mic.
Thank you, Dean Hairston. And welcome on behalf of the Chicago, Illinois chapter of the Links Incorporated. We're looking forward to an impactful and important discussion and conversation today. With your engagement, our hope is that it proves highly impactful. The Links Incorporated is an international organization of women dedicated to improving our communities through friendship and service. About 6 years ago, our chapter reset our program focus to reducing the stigma of mental health challenges in the African American community. We've worked with churches and community and youth groups via our Links to Hope program, receiving national recognition within our organization. We knew challenges facing our community were significant when we started this work. Now adding civil and racial injustices and unrest and a pandemic, we know there is much more to do. As we believe these conditions have resulted in more recognition of the importance of mental health resources in our community, our work now deepens to more education and action. That's why today's discussion is so important, and we thank you all so very much for joining. Our special thanks to the Lieutenant Governor, who we proudly include as our chapter member, her team, and Dean Hairston, Dr. Joseph Strickland, and the entire team at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at UIC. They have all been a pleasure to work with. A special debt of gratitude goes to our member and UIC professor, Annette Johnson, who has led us to today. When she and I began this journey well over a year and a half ago, we envisioned a small face-to-face roundtable. Technology has afforded us the opportunity to widen our audience, and we really hope you'll all engage. Thank you all to all of our panelists. As was said for Kemba Smith, this is part 2 of our program with her, and we really appreciate her being here, as well as all of our other panelists. Lastly, a special thanks to our moderator, who has been with us diligently through the planning of this event. Should this discussion spark ideas on how the links might work with you, please be in touch. We remain committed to educating, sharing resources, and creating deeper impact. So thank you again. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Xochitl Guerrero. Xochitl is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years of experience providing services to members of our most vulnerable communities. She received her graduate and undergraduate degrees from UIC and is currently a doctoral student at the Jane Addams College of Social Work. So she is currently a graduate research assistant at the Jane Addams Center for Social Policy and Research. Her research interests include the impact of parental incarceration and immigration detention on children and families. For nearly a decade, she provided mental health services to men and women detained at the Cook County Department of Corrections. She has also worked as a clinical social worker, providing mental health services to unaccompanied minors from Mexico and Central America. She is a proud first-generation college graduate and the mother of 5. Xochitl, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Risa, for that beautiful introduction. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our special guests and our panelists, and to all of you in the audience for being with us on this beautiful Friday morning. We have 4 amazing women with us today. I'm honored to be your moderator and excited to get our program started. Please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, not introduce yourselves, but shout out to your organizations or departments so we can all see who's with us, kind of digital way to network, if you will. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first guest, Lieutenant Governor Julianna Stratton. Lieutenant Governor Julianna Stratton is Illinois' 48th Lieutenant Governor. She is the first African-American to hold this office. Lieutenant Governor Stratton is passionate about equity and putting passion into government policymaking. Her portfolio includes leading the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative and chairing the Illinois Council on Women and Girls, the Governor's Rural Affairs Council, the Military Economic Development Council, and the Illinois Rivers Coordinating Council. She is the chair of the R3 board, Restore, Reinvest, Renew, and she co-chairs the Opioid Prevention and Recovery Steering Committee. Lieutenant Governor Stratton currently serves as treasurer of the National Lieutenant Governors Association. Previously, Lieutenant Governor Stratton represented the 5th District in the Illinois House of Representatives. Her first elected office was serving as chair of the Kenwood Academy Local School Council. As a lifelong advocate for youth and creating safe spaces for our young people, Lieutenant Governor Stratton is a restorative justice practitioner and trained peace circle keeper. She believes that where there is a void, we must take action to fill that need. Lieutenant Governor Stratton was born and raised on the south side of Chicago. She is a proud graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and DePaul University's College of Law. She and her husband, Brian, live in the Bronzeville community and have 4 beautiful daughters. Lieutenant Governor Stratton, welcome to the conversation.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Soshi, for welcoming me into this space and for moderating today's conversation. I'm so honored to be here and want everyone to know that I use the pronouns she, her. I am so grateful for the invitation from the Chicago chapter of the Links Incorporated and from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Both are very special to me. As was mentioned, I'm an active member of Links Incorporated and enjoy the sisterhood, support, and friendship throughout the years. And as many of you know, while I'm a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, I worked at UIC in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. And so it's so great to be back with my University of Illinois system family. To Links chapter president of the Chicago chapter, Risa Davis, and to Dean Creasie Hairston of the Jane Addams College of Social Work, as well as all of the participants, thank you for teaming up to put together this virtual event today. And I want to specifically also thank my friends, Annette Johnson and Joe Strickland, as well as Emily Harwell from Team JEO in my office for helping to organize this powerful conversation. And finally, to the incredibly inspiring Kemba Smith and all of our panelists and everyone really that's participating in today's conversation, thank you for your presence. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your engagement. You are the wisdom in the room, the way that we dialogue together and share ideas around this important work. And we're so glad that you are here. Earlier this week, I was so grateful to join the Women's Justice Institute team for the launch of their Redefining the Narrative report, which aims to reduce the women's prison population by 50% and beyond and combat the false stereotypes about women impacted by the justice system. I am so proud to be a part of an administration that joins in this work to redefine the narrative and which believes that justice and equity and opportunity should be available for all. So much that Governor Pritzker, during our first weeks in office, established what's called the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, which is housed in my office, and it seeks to bring an equity lens to policymaking. I want to say how proud I am that the director of our JEO, as we call it, thankfully, is a justice-impacted individual who understands the harm of the criminal legal system and provides tremendous leadership on what we must do to change this system and repair the harm. So our JEO really operates under several different assumptions. But number one, that too many view justice as simply being about policing jails and prisons. But as all of you know, real justice must be about access to health care, including mental health care and treatment for substance use disorders. Justice is about affordable housing and quality education and economic opportunity. It is about clean air to breathe and clean water to drink and healthy food to eat. And justice is not just about feeling safe, but it's about women actually being safe in our relationships and in the spaces in which we find ourselves. Another assumption of the JEO is that while it's critically important that we focus on re-entry and providing supports for people who are exiting our justice system, we can and we must do more to promote no entry and keeping women out of the system in the first place. And a third assumption that JEO operates under is rooted in the restorative justice principles and tapping into the wisdom that's found in rooms just like this. That the best solutions for transforming our criminal legal system come from communities where people are concerned and active. It comes by talking with people who have lived experience. We must work with and listen to the people that have been most affected by the system, communities that have borne the brunt of over-policing, over-incarceration, systemic racism, and generational disinvestment, and the trauma, quite frankly, that accompanies it all. So how does this play out in the JEO? Well, I'm proud to chair the Restore, Reinvest, and Renew Program Board, or R3, which we call it, which reinvests 25% of net tax revenues from adult cannabis sales in communities that have been most harmed by the war on drugs. And I'm especially proud that formerly justice-involved individuals serve on the R3 board and help make those funding decisions, because this is a matter of equity. It plays out as we work to advance the Department of Juvenile Justice 21st century transformation model, where we are closing down our large prison-like facilities that have caused so much trauma for our young people, increasingly Black and brown girls, and are now transforming what the justice system looks like in our state by having smaller, more therapeutic dorm-like facilities that are closer to communities where young people can get intensive wraparound services right in their own communities. And it's also about the work that we are doing with the Illinois State Treasurer's Office, Michael Frericks, to make sure that a college savings program for children of formerly incarcerated parents can, a pilot program like none that we've seen in our nation, to make sure that young people whose families have been justice impacted can have a real pathway to trade schools, community colleges, and four-year institutions, so that we can break the cycle and make sure that they are on the path to economic opportunity as well. We must give back to jumpstart any true change and resources that are central to this movement. We must reinvest in the communities and families that have suffered the most harm. And that is exactly what our JEO is doing. So I was proud to be the chief sponsor of the Women's Correctional Services Act when I was a member of the Illinois House of Representatives in 2018, which seeks to bring a trauma-informed and gender-responsive approach to women's corrections. It was also groundbreaking and the first in the nation. But we all know that there's so much more that we have to do, especially when it comes to the mental health of women that are justice impacted. And that's why we are here today. The bottom line is that as women, we're making it clear that we no longer want policy to be made for us. We want and need policy to be made by us and with us. And the work that we are doing today and the conversation that we are having today is an important part of making sure that policy making is done with the women that are on this call. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to our panel discussion.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Stratton. It is so exciting to hear about the wonderful work that's happening at the state level. I would like to introduce our next guest, Kemba Smith. Kemba, growing up as an only child in Richmond, Virginia, Kemba graduated high school and continued her education at the prestigious Hampton University. What happened to Kemba in her new campus environment was nothing short of a nightmare. and led to a 24.5-year sentence in a federal prison. In December 2000, after serving 6.5 years, President Clinton commuted her sentence to time served. Kemba shares her traumatic real-life experience in her book, Poster Child, The Kemba Smith Story, featured on CNN, Nightline, Court TV, The Early Morning Show, Donahue, Judge Hatchett, and a host of other television programs. Kemba's story has also been written about in several national publications, including The Washington Post, New York Times, Glamour, People, Jet, Emerge, Diverse Issues in Higher Education, and Essence magazines. Kemba is a graduate of Virginia Union University and was a past recipient for a 2-year Soros Justice Postgraduate Fellowship for Advocates. In December 2014, Kemba was appointed a member of the Virginia Criminal Sentencing Commission by Governor Terry McAuliffe. She has spoken at the White House, testified before Congress and the United Nations regarding a variety of criminal justice issues, including crack cocaine sentencing, mandatory drug sentencing, women in incarceration, felony disenfranchisement, and reentry. She is a popular speaker at colleges, universities, high schools, juvenile facilities, churches, and national conferences around the nation. She has received numerous awards and recognitions for her courage and determination to educate the public about the devastating consequences of current drug policies and for her commitment in serving young people. Kemba believes in sharing her story as an educational tool to prevent other youth from going down a similar path. Welcome, Ms. Kemba Smith, to our conversation.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Soshi, for that wonderful introduction, and congratulations in advance on your doctoral degree, because I know you are right there at the door. Also, thank you so much to the Chicago Links Incorporated, Risa Davis, and Dean Creasie, and Miss Annette Johnson. Thank you so much for the invitation for me to join you all in this conversation. And I was listening to Lieutenant Governor Stratton, and I was just like, oh my goodness, maybe I need to move to Illinois, because, in certain states across the country, well, everywhere across the country, the fight for criminal justice, we're going through some growing pains. And it was just very encouraging hearing all of what's going on and changing the narrative in Illinois. And so first and foremost, I want to start with a quote from our forever First Lady, Michelle Obama, where she says, "The difference between a broken community and a thriving one is the presence of women who are valued." The United States is one of the top incarcerators of women in the world. In the 90s, Black women were the fastest growing population within the prison system. While I was incarcerated, the Links Incorporated nationally joined Elaine Jones, who was the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, in advocating for my freedom. But it was bigger than just me. It was about the fastest growing population then were Black women. I still remember vividly Elaine bringing past President Pat Russell McLeod. I think Pat Russell McLeod was involved, but who came into the prison facility was Dr. Barbara Simpkins. And they came to visit me, and I was merely the poster child of criminal justice system gone wrong. I will forever be grateful for God's grace and for the support that I received. December 2020 marked 20 years that I walked out of prison, and what a journey it has been. I am the exception of most women coming out of the system. We are all sisters, and through my experience, advocacy, and empathy in knowing even in the midst of my privilege and access to resources, I struggled. There's a difference from being released from jail versus prison, and what's offered upon release varies from state to state. According to the Prison Policy Initiative, there are 81,000 releases from prison and 1.8 million releases from jail each year, but more incarcerated women are in jails than in state prisons. Jails typically provide fewer programs and services than prisons. So individuals released from jails are even less likely to have received necessary treatment or services while incarcerated than those in prison. Often women experience trauma even becoming incarcerated and throughout even before becoming incarcerated and throughout their incarceration. And for me, I think I need to highlight the trauma that I experienced prior to coming to incarceration. And I've been sharing my experience, my lived experience, and my story ever since my release for two reasons. One, I don't believe each and every person, in particular talking to young people, that each and every young person has to make each and every mistake there is to make, that they can hear another person's story and make a determination not to go down the same path. So, I take responsibility for the choices that I made, even while I was in prison, to help others. And that's why I went public with my story. But the second reason why I had been sharing my story is because I left so many other women behind in federal prison, and I felt the need to continue to be a human face to these issues. And so through my incarceration, even before getting incarceration, what led to that, as was mentioned in my bio, was that I was a college student, and got involved in a relationship. And eventually, he was knight in shining armor, but then there were red flags in the relationship, and the relationship was abusive. And the first time Peter, that was his name, the drug dealer that I got involved with, put his hands on me, I thought he was going to kill me. He strangled me to the point where blood vessels had popped all over my face and in my eyeballs. And the story, I listened to the I'm sorry's and him crying in my lap, telling me how it was never going to happen again. And I allowed myself to stay in this relationship. And through my experience, even though the prosecutor said I never handled, used, or sold any of the drugs involved, there was never any consideration in any of my court proceedings with regard to the trauma and abuse that I endured. Ultimately, there was expert testimony from domestic violence experts that spoke to the relationship that I had, and how fearful that I was. But my 86-year-old judge basically was caught sleeping in the courtroom. And there were supporters that wrote letters to the clerk noting that. But even still, after the expert testimony, even in knowing what my actual involvement was with the conspiracy, my 86-year-old judge just still sentenced me to 24 and a half years as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. And so for me, that was very traumatic, but I had it in my mind that I wasn't going to believe that I would actually spend that amount of time in prison. But one of my main sources of hope and maintaining faith and strength was that I actually turned myself in 7 months pregnant. And so never in a million years would I have imagined that, when I was a teenager, that I would be pregnant and in prison and in jail. I wasn't in prison yet, I was actually in jail. And so another traumatic experience was the fact that even in being in the jail, there were no policies in place for a woman who was pregnant in jail. And so, I'm sleeping on, a metal bed with a thin mattress in the night, given a snack with a cold bologna sandwich. So there was no thought to as far as nutrition, for my baby, my unborn baby. And so I can remember going into the clinic for my weekly doctor visits in handcuffs and shackles, and walking into the waiting room and people staring at me like I was a public spectacle, wondering what kind of crime did I commit. No one took into consideration the trauma of a pregnant woman having to go through that. And ultimately, I gave birth to my son, and 5 minutes after I gave birth to him, and let me back up, the prosecutor, when we talk about pretrial, I was not granted a bond to give birth to my son, even though the prosecutor said that he would, if I turned myself in, that he would allow me the opportunity to post bail. And he also said that if I pled guilty, that I would only get 24 months, and he reneged on both of those promises. But ultimately, after I gave birth to my son, the U.S. Marshals stormed into my hospital room and said that I couldn't have any visitors because my parents were there, and that my leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed at all times. And just one of the most humiliating, traumatizing experiences ever. And on top of that, to know that I had to go back to county jail. And when I did go back to county jail, there was no physical touch. I was not able to smell, feel, hold my son again until I was transferred over 2,000 miles away from my parents into federal prison in Dublin, California. And so there was no consideration as far as the trauma, how it was when, and if people don't want to look at the person who's incarcerated, and why doesn't anybody want to think about the impact on the child? And I can remember my parents telling me how my son wouldn't stop crying when they first brought him home. But what did help was they ended up moving his bassinet into my room where, and they put a clothing article of mine, and basically, I guess he was able to smell my scent that seemed to calm him down. But even in being transferred to a federal prison over 2,000 miles away, again, I'm grateful that my parents were able to have enough resources, but they ended up coming to visit me in California, where I was eventually reunited, with my son. And my mom asked me to put in a hardship in order to be transferred to a prison closer, because the only two prisons where I could go were Connecticut or California, because of how much time I had been sentenced to, which was 24 and a half years. And you had to have less than 15 years to go to a camp. And I believe the closest camp then was West Virginia. And so I ended up, going to prison in Danbury, Connecticut. And there was a magazine called Emerge Magazine where they highlighted my story. And I'm so grateful for that. And actually, as I mentioned previously, it was Pat Russell McLeod, past president of the Lynx, that led this national movement with LDF in order to bring me home. And so I'm grateful that the Lynx Incorporated has taken on this conversation, because ultimately my crime wasn't the fact that I was criminally minded. My crime was that I chose the wrong relationship. And prison did not teach me about healthy relationships. And if we had some time, I'll tell you some stories about since I've been home and having some sister talk. But ultimately, I look forward to the continued conversation because I know we have other wonderful panelists to speak, and hopefully we're able to inspire you all to help be a part of the change in pushing forth much needed conversations and much needed just looking at human people, and the fact that there needs to be special requirements, special needs in particular for women who are incarcerated. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Kemba, for sharing your story. The world is definitely a better place with you in it. I'm so happy to hear about all the great work that you're doing. I did not mention the Kemba Smith Foundation in my introduction, and I know you are doing wonderful work for our young ladies out there. If you wanted to drop that information in the chat, I'm sure everyone would love to have it. I would like to introduce our next two speakers, Celia Colon and Maya Schenwar. Celia is a speaker, author, community organizer, and activist advocating for both those incarcerated and also women and children's safety by fighting institutional and structural racism that fuels mass incarceration and generational harm. Celia is the founder of GOD, Giving Others Dreams. She focuses on removing the stigma of seeking mental health care and support. She develops and facilitates mental health workshops using transformational visual art and storytelling. Celia practices a powerful peer-to-peer approach of helping others heal and rebuild healthier, safer, stronger, and successful lives. She is dedicated to reducing the recidivism rate. Maya Schenwar is the editor-in-chief of Truth Out, the co-author of Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reforms, the author of Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better, and a co-editor of the anthology, Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. She has written about the prison industrial complex for Truthout, the New York Times, The Guardian, The Nation, Salon, Ms. Magazine, and many others. She is the recipient of a Society of Professionals Journalists Sigma Chi Award, an Independent Publisher Book Award, and the Women's Prison Association's Sarah Powell Huntington Leadership Award, and a Lannan Residency Fellowship. Maya organizes with the abolitionist collective Love and Protect and was a co-founder of the Chicago Community Bond Fund. Previous to her work at Truthout, Maya was contributing editor at Punk Planet magazine and served as media coordinator for Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Celia and Maya, welcome to the conversation. If we could begin with Celia, please.
Thank you for having me. An honor to be here. Pleasure to be with so many people who care about women. So my name is Celia Colon. I am the founder of GOD, which is Giving Others Dreams. It's a non-for-profit that holistically supports justice-impacted women. We provide them with direct reentry services and wraparound supports. And what I mean by holistic support, we show up. So when women come home from a carceral system, whether it's a jail, prison, or a treatment center, and they get a hold of me or somebody on my team, we welcome them home with a We Win Welcome Home care package. I believe it totally changes the success rate for someone when a village shows up who is there to support them. No judgment, no disparities, but just there to offer guidance, resource tools, and their heart, right? We pour out love and we bring them all the resources that they need for their first, I would say, 60 days. So like 14 outfits of interview ready clothes, and basically everything you need when you're moving into an apartment. When people come home from a prison or a jail, we're coming home back to the communities that we left, which is like, I'm from the South Side. Most people that come home in Illinois come home to Cook County, come home either to the West Side or to the South Side. Most of us who live on the West Side and the South Side are Black and brown. Most of us who are women who are Black and brown lost their jobs. I mean, that the numbers are out there with COVID-19. 66% of the workforce that was lost was women. So, you know, coming home, being a Black or brown woman, there's very little resources for us. So I decided when I came home 20 years ago, because I am also someone who's justice impacted, who spent my youth in prison, I decided to become what I needed when I came home. I didn't have a support system. I didn't have a place to go that serviced women. A lot of the times people always focus on, and I hear it a lot, they're always focused on the job part of reentry. And what they're not focused on is the social and emotional wellness of women, of people in general who come home from these carceral systems, who are traumatized even more from being in them spaces. There's so much harm that's there. There's so many levels of harm, and coming home and re-entry, there has to be so many levels of support, and there's not, you know? So because of that, my goal since I've been home is to remove the stigma of having mental health, wellness, and support become a part of somebody's re-entry plan. If they don't have this, whatever that is put in front of them, if we're not dealing with root causes, there's not going to be change. You know, the process of change is so hard. And it's so hard when you're dealing with many, multiple levels of trauma. No one can tell you how you're going to heal from that. And especially women, you know, we have the weight of society on our shoulders. We raise the next generation, and people fail to realize that childhood effects affect your life forever. And if we fail to realize and show up for women like we're supposed to, the next generation is doomed. You know, that's my biggest point, is that we need to create pathways to reentry, and they should start a year prior to someone's release, including parenting classes, mental health, wellness and support, anger management classes, things like that, things that really holistically help someone heal and deal with the root causes that even put someone in that place to be involved with the justice system.
Thank you so much, Celia. And we're going to hear from Maya. Thank you so much for sharing the wonderful things that you're doing, Celia.
I really appreciate you having me here today and the chance to join this important conversation. What everyone has said has been so powerful, and I'm grateful. So I want to take my time here to speak about my sister, Keely, because she isn't here to speak for herself anymore. I want to mention that even one night in jail can impact a person for life when it comes to trauma and mental health. And my sister spent half her life in and out of incarceration. Keely was arrested in school at the age of 14 for small-time drug possession. At 15, she ended up in juvenile detention. And while she was inside, she was told she was nothing more than a number, that even her name didn't matter, and certainly that her life would amount to nothing. She was abused, medically neglected, placed in solitary confinement. And when she got out, she really saw nothing out here for herself, and she began to develop an addiction to heroin. Incarceration, that early incarceration, at least in part, provoked and caused my sister's mental health and addiction problems. So when we talk about mental health for women who are incarcerated, I think we always need to talk about how incarceration drives those problems. So for 15 years, Keely was in and out of institutions: prison, jail, probation, court-mandated treatment centers that sometimes looked a lot like jails, electronic monitoring, and house arrest. My sister's first baby was born while she was incarcerated. I want to say thank you so much to Kemba for sharing her story earlier about pregnancy and birth in prison. My sister was also pregnant in prison, and when my niece was born, she was torn from my sister's arms after 24 hours. And my sister was led away from her in handcuffs and shackles. And with every trauma that happened to Keely while she was incarcerated, she fell further and further into despair and into her addiction. Last year, Keely was newly out of jail for, I think this was her 9th incarceration, and she was struggling. She was thrust into a mandated treatment program that was abstinence-based. So she was not actually able to consistently get the opioid maintenance drugs that she needed to avoid using heroin. And she was calling me every night, crying. And then one night she didn't call. And then the next night and the next night, she didn't call. We searched for her everywhere, but eventually my parents and I got the news that her body had been found in a tent under a viaduct surrounded by needles. We lost my sister thanks to a system that often abandons women who are struggling with mental health and substance use issues, which are deeply, deeply intertwined. And I'm sharing all this with you today because I think that we need to keep these kinds of stories present and with us, because this is the first step to working for a world in which we don't lose any more precious lives. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya, so much for sharing your insights and your very touching experience with all of us. And thank you to all our panelists for all the incredible work you are doing to advocate for women whose lives have been impacted by the justice system. Truly incredible work. And now, if I could invite all our guests back so that we can begin our Q&A session. We will begin with a few prepared questions for our panelists and then dive into some of the questions coming in from our participants through the Q&A box. So just a quick reminder, please do post your questions in the Q&A box. There's some folks that are monitoring those questions and getting them ready so that we can address them to our panelists. We have some great questions coming in already. Looks great. If we could have all of our panelists, wonderful. And we will begin with our first question, which is about mental health services for justice-involved women. How, and I'm going to address this to Kemba, please, if you could begin the response. How and when should the mental health needs of justice-involved women be addressed?
Oh, that is a really broad question. I think the mental health needs should be addressed in the very beginning. Once there's interaction with the system, I know, when I think back and think about PSI, pre-sentence report, and maybe even before the pre-sentence report, because if I was pre-trial and I wasn't granted a bond, the PSI came much later. So even into entrance into the jail, that there should be a social work component, in my opinion, that at intake of a jail, to see where someone is, to see what kind of trauma that they have experienced, to see what kind of needs could be met. And this mental health conversation is broad in scope. So I know we have mental health in schools. We have mental health, connect with hospitals. Well, we need to have better mental health connections, agencies that are already there at the jails upon entry. And then maybe based on that interaction at the jails, that same individual could be a part of the process of the pre-sentence report. So a judge can take those mental health trauma aspects individually into consideration. So I think that's one way that it could begin with the off the top response with that question. Anyone else?
Well, I'll jump in because, and I just want to say before I begin my remarks, how grateful I am of the personal stories that have been shared. Kemba, Celia, Maya, thank you so much for your honesty and forthrightness in sharing your stories, and that of your sister, Maya. So let me just say that I want to really emphasize, as I said in my opening remarks, how important it is that we have resources in our communities, because so many women are entering our justice system because of the trauma that they have experienced, whether that is trauma related to sexual violence, trauma related to domestic violence, trauma that's related to living in under-resourced communities, which, by the way, in the midst of all of this violence, don't have access to mental health resources and trauma-informed resources. So I really want to keep advocating so that, yes, we need to focus on more services for the women that are in our system. And we certainly have to work towards making sure that women coming out of our system have access to resources upon reentry that are trauma-informed, gender-responsive, and centered on the family. But at the same time, I just believe we can do so much more in this country and certainly in our state, and we're working on that, to keep women out of the system. If you have experienced sexual violence and that then leads to your incarceration, what would happen if we had trauma-informed services so that you never get to the jail or the prison in the first place, so that you never have to experience the trauma of being separated for your child or giving birth while you are in a prison? Those are things that we can do to prevent on the front end. And so if we had more intensive access to mental health services and trauma-informed services, maybe we could continue. And that's what we're working on here in Illinois when we say we want to cut the prison population of women by 50% or more. I just wanted to, before I pass it on to the next person, I just want to kind of give a little bit of context. Per the Women's Justice Institute, women with histories of abuse and neglect are 77% more likely to be arrested as an adult than their peers who have not experienced abuse. So that means that this is not an issue of just someone who quote unquote just doesn't know how to follow the law. We're talking about people who are often doing things to survive, doing things to thrive. And that should not lead someone to being incarcerated. Black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women, and Latinas 1.2 times the rate of white women. 1 in every 18 Black women will go to prison during their lifetimes. 1 in 18. And that number for Latinas is 1 in 45. For white women, it's 1 in 111. So there's an intersection with not only with mental health issues and trauma, there's an intersection with race. And so to say that we're going to re-victimize women when you have no resources in your community, or you don't have access to the best mental health care or insurance and all of those other things, so the only thing we can do is send you to prison, that is unacceptable. And so I think we have to do what we can for those women that are in the system, absolutely, those who are returning, but let's do more to keep women out of the system in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. 100%. We have a long way to go. Celia, Maya, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lieutenant, for all of those wonderful recommendations and for the work that you're doing. Yes, I agree with both of the ladies, what they have said in regards to supporting women. You know, it starts, they always say, at home. You know, it takes a village, right? It takes us to save us. And that's what I like to say. I would love if, you know, the schools would implement a holistic approach to meditation, to, instead of punishing children, right? Kicking them out when they're not listening or not participating in class, but really just putting them to the side and saying, hey, what's going on with you? What's going on with your house? And offering mental health services within the school, creating a curriculum that is focused on healing, because us as Black and brown people who live in the city of Chicago, we're constantly dealing with unhealed trauma, which just changes people's lives in so many directions. No one can tell you, any professor would tell you, no one can tell you how you're going to heal from trauma. So because they removed a lot of the mental health wellness programs and support groups within our communities, they need to start implementing it and putting them in places where people go, maybe to the schools, maybe to the Department of Human Services, things where it's accessible and there's people that look like them, that really understand culture and understand what we face on a daily basis living in this city where the violence is just so overwhelming. I believe that together, when we decide that as humanity, that prevention is the key, and we really start showing up, especially for women, because right now, the numbers show everywhere, statistically, there's not enough support to holistically support the emotional and social needs of women. We also are still not making the same amount of money as men. So how can we work just 1 9 to 5 and be a mom? Most of us who are single moms have to work 2 jobs. So that means we're neglecting our kids when we don't want to, which puts them into the streets and puts them in harm's way. Again, a child, you know, someone's childhood depends on the social wellness of the mother. And if the mother is not well supported, then neither is the child.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Celia. That's absolutely true. And that's a great segue to our next question. And I would like to ask the Lieutenant Governor if she could begin the response. Our next question pertains to incarcerated mothers. Given that the majority of incarcerated women are also mothers, what services and policies would help incarcerated mothers and their families best maintain those essential parent-child relationships? Lieutenant Governor, if you could begin.
Sure, and thank you so much, Soshi, for that question, because I think it's so critical, whether you are a mother or not. I think we all have mothers or have mothers, and we all understand the value of mothers. And so when we think about women being separated, women being separated from their children, we know right off the bat that that's causing harm. I mean, we know right off the bat that that's causing some harm. So too often what we see is that when mothers are incarcerated, too often, I'm not going to say it happens every time, but too often we do know that that increases the chance of a child perhaps also having contact with the justice system, particularly if there's not, again, intensive support, mental health supports, trauma-informed supports, not just for the mother, but for the children. And some of the women that I've talked to also talk about how difficult it is to come back even after being incarcerated, reuniting with their children, and some of the challenges that happen when you've been gone for 10 years, 15 years, and now you come back and are asked to reintegrate into your family, and yet the children are dealing with issues as well as the women, and there are no resources in the community. So we see this vicious cycle in our criminal legal system that really tears families apart and often leads to the child being swept into the system themselves. And we have to interrupt that cycle and break that cycle. So I'm really proud of the work we're doing here in Illinois in partnership with State Representative and Leader Delia Ramirez and the Cabrini Green Legal Aid. Our office helped to administer the Children of Incarcerated Parents Task Force, which really came up with some recommendations on how to improve outcomes for these children of incarcerated parents, and to really make sure that we are bringing to bear all of the governmental agencies that can really make sure that we promote communication between parents, making sure that these families have high quality services and resources. We also found that there are some trauma-informed policies and training for law enforcement and corrections agencies all throughout our state that have been lacking, particularly at the time of arrest. Imagine being 3 years old and you see your parent being arrested. So we are working on things like reunification rides to make sure that children can get with their parents and visit and have time with their parents, even if they're incarcerated. We know that visitation policies all across the state are often highly limited, and we need to make sure that, for example, in nearly half of our state's county jails, there is no visitation with children. That is a problem because we know having time, even if the parent is incarcerated, that time is important. So we have to make investments in all of these areas to make sure that families we don't just look at the women who are incarcerated, but the entire family. And that is something that, fortunately, thanks to the leadership of Leader Ramirez, we're focused on here in Illinois.
Yes.
Most definitely. Yes, Kemba, please go ahead.
Lieutenant Governor Stratton, she's just so on point. You are my new idol, like to follow and to see all the great work that you're doing, because ultimately, you know, even years later after being out of prison, some of the time I feel like I can still have a institutional, systematic way of thinking, and it was just interesting to hear her say we need to be looking at not incarcerating women, ending that cycle, that system. When, you know, I in fact feel as if, you know, and everybody might not have the same opinion as I, but I don't feel like that I should have been incarcerated for my personal involvement, and I take ownership of, you know, the poor choices, but to, you know, we need to start reimagining criminal justice and what's defined as a crime, and look at the holistic approach. And so for me, when you talk about children and a mother being incarcerated, you know, it's like I can say this, but at the same time, I do think that we should look at not incarcerating women in particular. You know, I can say mothers, but then also whoever it is, that sole provider for that particular child. But I believe that there should be, you know, alternatives to that. And so, you know, the impact of how it is on the children. You know, my son is 26 years old, and as Lieutenant Governor Stratton said, I mean, he has not had any interactions with the criminal justice system, but that in fact, you know, statistically does happen. But there are other consequences, you know, and so I'm a firm believer in therapy. You know, I'm grateful that, you know, I go to my therapist every 2 weeks. But there are consequences that come, even though, you know, I spent 6.5 years in federal prison, and luckily I had a president that signed a document that released me. But even with the privilege of what my son was provided, my parents were able to care for him, but he's, you know, they're still dealing with anxiety issues from stuff that they experience. They're things that you learn in your childhood. And I think that, you know, national mental health experts, advocates need to jump in this conversation in this, in doctors, and how it impacts children to have their parents incarcerated, and find out how this country can change from incarcerating its own people and find out alternatives to changing behaviors and lifestyles.
Thank you so much, Kemba, for sharing those insights. We are going to actually, in the interest of time, we are going to switch to our, transition to our questions from the audience. And we have so many questions coming in.
So before you transfer over, can I just say one comment
Yes,
before you leave this? So what I wanted to say was that even when you come home from prison, you are still excluded from your child's life. And what I mean by that is that in Illinois, there has to be change in regards to allowing you to volunteer at your child's school. Because I was denied when my child, who wasn't even a thought in my mind when I was locked up at 18, when she graduated from 8th grade 4 years ago, I was denied access to be a parent, to participate as a volunteer for the chaperoning and the parties. And my case happened over 25 years ago. Like, when does that end? That generational harm, making her wear my number and my shame. What if I never even told my daughter about that part, right? So we're still being locked out in a lot of spaces of our kids' lives, and that has to change.
Yes, 100%. That does have to change. Thank you, Celia. We are going to start with a question for the Lieutenant Governor from the audience. A question related to the difference between how the justice system impacts women differently from men. There's a great disparity there. If you could speak to that, please.
Yes, well, thank you so much for that question. Let me just give you one example. I think about just who we are as women and how we communicate with each other as women, how we talk, how we relate to one another, just our personalities and the way that we engage. So I've already talked about, and I don't think I have to repeat what we've all been talking about, is the trauma and the way that women experience that trauma that often, or the survival offenses that lead people to the system in the first place. But even in the system, when we went, so I went to Logan Correctional Center, which is a women's facility here in Illinois. I do want to also mention that First Lady M.K. Pritzker is taking huge leadership on working on issues relating to women that are incarcerated and trying to change the system. And I just wanted to acknowledge her work as that of Governor Pritzker, who has been an ally every step of the way. So we went to Logan Correctional Center and we started to talk to some of the women who were incarcerated there about things like, if there was another woman there who was going through a difficult time, and if we hugged or touched because we were comforting one another, we were given a ticket. If there were so things like that, or, a woman who said, because I braided my hair, which really I took offense to, because this was about a woman who was talking about visiting her child. She was denied visits because her hair was in braids was considered contraband. So those are just a couple of examples of how there are some unique ways that we as women are just different. And a system here in Illinois, and I probably could say across the country, but what happened was when they created these women's facility, no one from the very beginning said, how are women different? And let's make sure that when we build these facilities, or when we move them to be women's facilities, and we create programming and we create policies and protocols, let's specifically think about the differences of women so that women aren't getting tickets for things that wouldn't apply. So I think it's just like anything else. We have to, all of us in different spaces that we find ourselves in, we go into whether it's a boardroom or a classroom or any other room, we're different as women. And it's the same thing for our corrections facilities. And if we're not intentional then what we will do is we will move the men out, bring the women in, and we will do nothing differently. And that just can't be the case. So we have to think about who women really are. Why did they get there? What is the difference of a mother and how a mother's interaction with her child? Again, the fathers are important too. Nothing that I'm saying today is to negate the men in the system. I do a lot of work on that too. But women have different needs. And unfortunately, this system doesn't think about the needs that women have.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor Stratton. Definitely 100% agree with you on that. A question directed to Maya, if you could address this question related to mental health and substance dependence. And as someone who's experienced tragedy with respect to this, what are changes in the criminal justice or in social policies in general that might prevent women from having to be incarcerated in the first place?
Yeah, so I think that we really need to be focusing on policy change that happens way before the criminal legal system even enters people's lives. So even before that idea of incarceration is on the horizon. And in terms of mental health and substance use, I think this in part means providing many different options for voluntary mental health services starting young. We need sufficient numbers of counselors in schools. We need social workers in all schools, small class sizes. We need abundant community-based mental health services that, people can easily access. That's not something that we have right now in so many communities. We need abundant childcare. I've been thinking about this a lot, which I think in addition to everything else it is a type of mental health care for parents. If you think about it broadly, I think we need to ensure that everyone has full access to physical health care, because physical health care and mental health care and substance use issues are all connected. So that means real universal health care. And I think that also when we think about addiction and how it overlaps with mental health needs, we need to be prioritizing harm reduction and meeting people where they're at. So instead of always demanding abstinence in line with kind of our country's emphasis on prohibition, which obviously has not worked to help people survive, we need to be putting in place widespread drug checking services so people can actually know if their drugs are contaminated with fentanyl. We need to be bolstering initiatives like the Chicago Recovery Alliance here in Chicago, which are helping people survive even if they're using drugs, providing naloxone, drug safety checking, like I said, fentanyl test strips, clean needles, all of those things. I think we need to be supporting people in surviving, regardless of what they're doing, what drugs they're using, what position they're in society. I feel like right now, what people don't realize is we are imposing the death penalty in so many ways. People are dying all around us, and instead of holding to this prohibition mentality, which we know has failed us, we need to move on.
Thank you so much, Maya. There's definitely a lot of changes that need to take place. And unfortunately, we have run out of time for our audience questions. This is certainly a conversation that can and should continue. And I encourage you all to talk amongst each other outside of this forum, back at your organizations and departments. Definitely something that we should and can continue talking about. On that note, I would like to ask the Lieutenant Governor and Ms. Kemba Smith to share their calls to action with us and let us know, where do we need to go and how can we get there together? Lieutenant Governor, if you could begin, please.
Absolutely. Well, I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I have, I always think about the ways that we continue to expand what I call the Justice League, people who are going to band together and do this work. And I know there's so many of you who have joined this line. And I just want to thank all of the panelists, as well as you, Soshi, for moderating this important conversation and for having me today. I close my remarks by first and foremost speaking the name of Sandra Bland, an Illinois woman, a Black woman, a sister, a daughter, a woman who was loved by her friends and sorority sisters, who was found hanged in a jail cell in Texas 3 days after a traffic stop. And I always think about a conversation I had last year with her sisters, who talked about the ongoing trauma that they are experiencing, trauma that her mom is still experiencing to this day. I speak the name of Maria, a woman that I met as we were talking about the efforts of the Women's Correctional Services Act when I was still a state representative. And she said these words, and I'm going to close out with them because she told me I could share these words. She said, I was in prison, and then I went to prison. And then I returned back to prison. Those words have never left me, that it's not just the institution or the correctional facility. It is about what can we all do to change the conditions in our communities so that no one feels like they go to an institution called prison and come home to their communities and still feels like it's as traumatic as prison. That shouldn't be the case for anyone. And so my call to action is, yes, doing what you're doing today. I know I see so many comments in the chat of the work that you all are doing. I know Emily put her email that you hopefully will connect with our office and our Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative to continue the work, that you'll continue to keep in touch with Maya and Celia and Kemba and all of those who are speaking today. But what I would say is my main call to action, because I know you all are already advocates, is to remember our sisterhood as women. When you talk about women's empowerment, do not forget the women that are behind bars and jails and prisons throughout our state. When you talk about the Me Too movement and taking a stand against sexual harassment, don't forget the women that are behind the bars and jails and prisons all throughout our state. When we talk about all these great things for mothers and childcare, as Maya mentioned, and other issues that really affect women, gender pay, equity, and all of that, don't forget the women that are behind the bars and prisons, because they need us to continue to be a voice, and we need to lift up their voices as well. So thank you all for all the work that you're doing. I look forward to continuing this fantastic work alongside all of you to make a difference in the lives of women that have been justice impacted throughout our state. They are our sisters.
Thank you so very much for joining us, Lieutenant Governor Stratton. We actually have a few more minutes for a couple of questions. We were a little bit ahead of time, so I am actually going to address a question to Celia.
But Soshi, I just want to say, I gave my close and I was like right there. So I don't have anything else. I'm like, I'm there. I'll answer a question, but I gave it. I'm done with my closing.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So many questions coming into the chat, and I appreciate you, giving us some direction on where we can go from here. Absolutely, 100%. And I'm going to ask Ms. Kemba Smith actually to share her call to action in just 1 second. I just wanted to get to one question that a lot of folks from the audience are addressing or posting in the Q&A for Celia in regard to the issue of homelessness for women and how important that is in terms of addressing a lot of these issues. If you could just briefly share a couple of thoughts on that, and then we're going to get to Ms. Kemba's call to action and close out our event. Thank you.
So homelessness is a huge, huge space where we need to all help out, because right here in Illinois, there's hardly any shelters for women, especially women with children, especially if you have a little boy. When women come home from prison, there is maybe one re-entry home that they can go to. There's a huge waiting list. I know Safer has like a adult transition center that has over 224 beds for men. There is very little spaces for women. A lot of the times women go back to very harmful spaces. So sometimes when people say, yes, I have housing, you have to go further and say, are you comfortable in that house? Are you safe in that house? Because sometimes they won't tell you that they're sleeping on the floor or they're sleeping on the couch, just so they have a safe space to stay. It's very hard for women to find a safe space. And that's something that we really need to put our dollars in, is transitional housing for women, safe transitional housing.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Without a place to stay, that's the common, that's the first.
Soshi,
Yes, yes, ma'am.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Celia said, that
Please.
our Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative is working with our Department of Corrections and the Illinois Housing Development Authority to we developed a pilot program, put $3 million in to specifically work on housing supports for people who are exiting our Department of Corrections. It's not enough of where we need to go, but we have certainly paid attention to that issue, because being housing insecure is also traumatic. And to come from an institution and then you can't even have a place to live for yourself or your family, all that does is lead to recidivism, with people cycling in and out of the system. So housing at a very baseline must be available.
Thank you, Lieutenant. I have a lady that I'm serving that just came home. She got kicked out of 4 different shelters because they wouldn't take her because she's on house arrest because she just came home. So she's also on Suboxone, which is a treatment to not use drugs. And they won't take her because a lot of the shelters have a no substance use policy. And that has to change because, some people need assistance coming off of, drugs. And this lady's going back to prison because we couldn't find a place to put her.
Thank you so very much, Celia. And we are so blessed and just blessed to have the Lieutenant Governor in our conversation today and doing all this important work. And the conversation and the interaction between folks like Celia, who are on the front lines, and someone in the highest, one of the highest offices in our state, talking with one another in this forum and outside of this forum to get us to where we need to be. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor Stratton, for being with us today. I'm going to ask Ms. Kemba Smith if she would leave us with her call to action on where we can go from here.
Well, it was great that we had the additional questions, because I was just like, why do they have me keep talking after Lieutenant Governor Stratton? I can't follow that, because I was stuck on when I was in prison. No, I was in prison when I came home. I was in prison. And it goes on, because when you talk about, a call to action and what we were just talking about as far as housing, Celia Cologne, she's an idol of mine. We've both participated in Just Leadership USA. And the importance of having people who have been impacted at the table in helping to find the solutions. And if you're interested in learning more about formerly incarcerated people who are at tables and doing wonderful work across the country, just go on Just Leadership USA's website, and you can meet all the leaders that are doing work. For myself in Virginia, I'm grateful that the governor appointed me to the Virginia Parole Board, and I'm actually a voting member here. And so I think that we need to recognize formerly incarcerated people and the work that they're doing, and the advocacy and the community building, and having them at the table at nonprofits and government and all different areas to help change the narrative with criminal justice. And so that would be one. Second, I mentioned already, as far as alternatives to incarceration, or even redefining what we define a crime as being. And then lastly, for me, again, where that statement that Lieutenant Governor Stratton said, when in 2008, when President Obama was running for president, I was in prison. I couldn't vote. It's like when I wanted to get housing, and I explained to the woman how I received executive clemency from a president, and she told me about the application process, and she told me off the top, 99%, we probably won't accept you into our community. I was in prison. And so there are a variety of things that need to be changed, but I think with the narrative and the source, when you look at the source of incarceration, the 13th Amendment said basically that, with the exception of if you commit a crime, that slavery is legal. And then we fought so hard as Black people to get the right to vote, and voter suppression laws across this country stemmed from slavery. And well, I know in particular in Virginia, it did. And so for me, we need to start at the source and deal with the root of some of these problems. And I congratulate the state of Illinois, because I know that, once you come out of prison, that you are automatically, your voting rights are automatically restored. But I think that's a good starting point for people to recognize, number one, slavery's gone, and we are humans. Formerly incarcerated people are humans, no matter, I speak about, my stuff was nonviolent. Regardless, violent, nonviolent, people were human first. We are human, and that we should look at them and understand that people can change. And even inside prison, why even inside prison, there's states such as DC, Maine, and Vermont. Why even in prison do we get discounted as even being human? And so I think we need to start in changing the mindset to get people to recognize that, and the importance of sharing stories. And so I don't do a good job plugging myself some of the time, but if you're interested in knowing more about my personal story, I have a book, Poster Child, that talks about that. But, Celia and I learned from Just Leadership the importance of storytelling and highlighting, personal stories. You can have the statistics and facts and numbers, but you really don't draw people in until you share those personal stories. And so I'll just end with the quote that I began with from Michelle Obama, which is, the difference between a broken community and a thriving one is the presence of women who are valued. And I echo what Lieutenant Governor Stratton said, and the fact that we need to, when we look at criminal justice, we need to be highlighting the specific lens of women and children, because it's so far behind and lagging. I know there are probably still some prisons, jails across the country that don't have a parenting program. And even if we did look at it in a woman's lens, I can't imagine. And I think some of the time I consciously block it out. But if I was still in prison and it had been over a year since I had contact with my son because of COVID, I would be losing my mind. But then people are expected, women in particular. Even in slavery, we knew how a Black woman would chop off her kid's foot. I've read personal narratives because they wouldn't want their child to be sold in slavery. But within these prisons and jail, these women are still expected to follow the rules, not get an infraction, not be, depressed and not want to stand for count. And they get written up, and someone will see that on the record and be like, oh, they haven't changed. So we need to humanize people and get people to understand our journeys. So thank you. Sorry.
No apologies at all necessary. Thank you so much, Kemba, for sharing your story with us. You are absolutely correct. There is a long way for us to go, and we are very lucky to have you in this world advocating for the needs of women in the justice system. And as we close our program out, before we get to our final remarks from Ms. Annette Johnson, Maya, and I would like to invite Maya and Celia to make share some brief closing statement with us before we go to to close out our program.
I would just like to say that when we radically show up for one another and truly invest in each other, we can break cycles of destruction and harm. It takes us to save us. We have great people in the lieutenant and in the governor's office that's doing great strides to make change here in the city of Chicago. But yet, all of these strides, it seems like a little slow turtle when you're seeing the hurt and you feel the hurt on a daily basis. I can see it just walking outside my door, living on the south side of Chicago. I believe that, the more that we actually show up with action and not just talk, but really do these deep investments. And I'm so grateful for the R3 program, because now it's finally allowing investments into the West and the South Side that have been ignored for like over 40 years. When we start to create economical wealth and development and really start to implement and invest in our education and really holistic approaches to really healing from trauma. That's what's missing, is the healing portion, that holistic approach, that emotional and social needs need to be met. Everyone that lives in the city, everyone that lives in the United States, we're affected by violence more than we should due to the internet. So I think that we should really start to look at social and emotional needs of people in general. Thank you.
Yeah, I can just say really quickly, you know, everyone in women's prisons is a survivor. You know, we see these statistics, 99% or what, really everyone in women's prisons is a survivor, because even if they somehow did not experience violence before incarceration, incarceration is a type of violence and a type of trauma that women are experiencing. And I think that as we process that, we need to, as Kemba brought up really powerfully, think about why people are incarcerated in the first place, challenging even this non-violent, violent binary, challenging the idea that anyone deserves to be in a cage. I think we need to start doing that. The things that we have talked about today, women facing unspeakable violence behind bars, including being torn from their own children. To me, that's such a deep act of violence in itself, you know. And if you think about what women have done to end up in prison, you know, compared to that act of kidnapping, I think we can see just how violent the system is. And so I think this is really a moment for us to come together and recognize that the prison isn't working, and we need to imagine what could work. We need to imagine what are all those community resources that we need to be building, that we need to be funding, and what are all those restorative and transformative solutions that we can think about in relation to harm and violence, because clearly it exists in the world, you know, it exists in prisons, it exists in the world more broadly. So we need to be thinking about that too. And I just want to say, like, that's not only the job of policymakers, that's the job of all of us. If we truly believe that we can build something different, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to start doing that ourselves, you know. And I'll say I'm a prison abolitionist, and I feel like one of the things that people often don't understand is that with the acknowledgement that prison is violence, that we don't want to use prison, we need to acknowledge that each of us has a responsibility to think about how we can address harm and violence, and how we can address all of these issues that lead to incarceration in our society.
And real quick,
thank you so much, Maya. Yes.
Can I just, because the first person that educated me to help me accept the fact that the choices that I made, that they were natural choices that women make in relationships, and helped me understand the bigger picture, was Beth Ritchie. And because she's a Chicago native as well, and she has a book, Arrested Justice, and she helped with bringing me home and work with my attorneys. But I just wanted to acknowledge her and her work, and feel free to look her up because she is an expert in this subject matter as well.
And I would like to ask if we could have some words from Ms. Annette Johnson, who's going to close out our program. I would like to thank all of our special guests and panelists for the incredible work that they're doing, and for sharing some time with us this morning. Ms. Annette Johnson, could you close out our remarks, please?
Thank you so much. I'd just like to say thank you so much for our panelists and for such a powerful dialogue today. And I just want to just reiterate from all of the panelists, you heard us talk about what Lieutenant Governor talking about prevention. So we really have to think prevention, and prevention not just from the perspectives of the women that are incarcerated, but the people that are impacted. So we need to talk about prevention at the school level. We need to think about prevention at the community level. And certainly we need to talk about the intersectionality of race as it relates to women that are incarcerated. Again, we really hope that we leave this dialogue today with each of you making a commitment to go back into your agencies, your communities, your families, your churches, and to begin to raise this conversation. Because when we know that women and the women in prison are so significant in terms of, to all of us, in terms of improving the life for our communities. So again, thank you so much for coming and continue to lift this work up, and know that the partners who participated on this panel are very committed and will continue to lift this work up and look for other opportunities to engage you. Again, thank you.